Data sovereignty is the idea that information is subject to the laws and legal powers of the place where that information is held, and the practical implication is that location can change who gets to regulate, access, restrict, or compel disclosure. When security professionals talk about where the data lives, they are not being philosophical, they are pointing at the legal levers that become available to governments and regulators. A data set stored in one country may be treated as within that country's authority, even if the people who created it, the users it describes, and the company that benefits from it are somewhere else. That means location is not just about latency, cost, and resilience, because it also changes the legal control surface around confidentiality, disclosure, and retention. If you want to design systems that hold up under audits, investigations, and cross-border operations, you have to treat geography as part of the threat and compliance model. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Sovereignty, in this context, is best understood as the set of laws that apply because the data resides within a particular territory or is otherwise treated as present there. The key point is not that the data is physically sitting on a specific disk you can point to, because modern infrastructure abstracts that away, but that the legal system can still assert that the data is within its reach. That reach can include privacy rules, breach notification obligations, sector regulations, record-keeping mandates, and government access authorities, all of which can change based on the country or even the subnational region involved. In other words, sovereignty is a legal wrapper that comes attached to the storage and processing environment, whether or not the business teams think of that wrapper as part of the system. This is why jurisdictional control often becomes a constraint on architecture, not an after-the-fact compliance checkbox. A common source of confusion is that people use residency, localization, and sovereignty as if they were interchangeable, and in practice they are not. Data residency usually refers to where the data is stored, which often means the primary storage location, and sometimes means backup locations as well. Data localization is typically a stronger requirement that data must stay within a defined boundary, often a country, and that boundary can apply to storage, processing, or both. Data sovereignty is broader than either term because it is about which legal regime has authority, and authority can be asserted even when the storage and processing patterns are more complex than a single home location. If you treat these as the same, you end up meeting a residency promise while accidentally violating a localization requirement. Or you end up localizing data while still exposing yourself to an unexpected sovereign claim. Jurisdiction is triggered by more than one factor, and the most operationally relevant triggers usually involve where the data is stored, where it is processed, and where the organization has a meaningful presence. Storage region is the easiest trigger to understand because a platform region selection often maps to a country or legal area that can claim authority over data at rest. Processing can trigger jurisdiction when data is accessed, transformed, analyzed, or routed through a place that asserts legal control over activities occurring within its boundaries, even if the long-term storage is elsewhere. Business presence can also matter because regulators may claim authority based on incorporation, offices, employees, customers, or targeted market activity within their territory. The important lesson is that jurisdiction is not a single switch. It is a set of conditions that can activate overlapping obligations and access powers. Once jurisdiction is in play, the roles of controller and processor become critical, especially when operations cross borders. A controller, in privacy terms, is the party that determines why and how personal data is processed, while a processor is the party that processes personal data on behalf of the controller. Those roles create different duties, and those duties can shift depending on the legal regime, the contract, and the operational reality of who is making decisions. Across borders, controllers often carry the heavier burden for lawful basis, transparency, purpose limitation, data subject rights, and cross-border transfer legitimacy, while processors focus on security measures, processing only on instructions, and supporting the controller's compliance. If the architecture and vendor model blur who is actually determining purposes and means, you risk becoming a controller when you thought you were merely a processor, which can expand obligations dramatically and unexpectedly. Government access is the point where sovereignty becomes concrete, because it is where legal authority can compel production, access, or assistance. Different jurisdictions have frameworks for lawful access, which can include warrants, court orders, administrative demands, national security directives, and regulatory requests, each with its own thresholds and oversight structures. The existence of a lawful request process does not mean every request is valid or properly scoped, but it does mean you need an operational path for receiving, reviewing, and responding in a controlled way. From a security perspective, the concern is not only disclosure of content, but also disclosure of metadata, logs, subscriber information, and technical details that can enable further compromise. This is one reason legal, security, and platform teams must align, because the technical design can either limit what can be produced or make overproduction easy. When information moves across borders, organizations rely on transfer mechanisms and safeguards that are meant to preserve protections even when data leaves its originating regime. The mechanics vary by jurisdiction, but conceptually you are trying to ensure that the receiving environment maintains adequate privacy and security controls, and that there is a recognized legal basis for the transfer. Examples include contractual approaches, such as standard contractual clauses, organizational approaches, such as binding corporate rules, and, in some situations, specific consent or necessity-based grounds depending on the applicable law. Safeguards also include technical and organizational controls like access restrictions, auditing, and minimization of transferred fields so that the cross-border movement is limited to what is truly required. The security takeaway is that transfer compliance is not purely legal paperwork, because the safeguards often assume that your technical controls actually enforce the promised limitations. These sovereignty constraints quickly become real when you choose cloud regions and decide how to structure services, because region selection is a jurisdiction decision disguised as a performance setting. When you deploy a workload into a region, you are usually choosing the legal environment for the primary storage, and you may also be choosing the legal environment for operational access, support, and incident handling. Service architecture choices can unintentionally broaden the jurisdictional footprint, for example, by centralizing logs in a different region, performing analytics in a shared platform, or relying on a managed service that processes data in locations you did not explicitly select. A strong design practice is to treat region and service dependencies as part of the data flow model, so you can trace where data is stored, where it is processed, and which operational teams can access it under which legal systems. If you do that work early, you avoid discovering later that a seemingly minor service dependency broke a residency promise. Contracts often carry the practical enforcement of sovereignty requirements, especially when you rely on external providers and their subcontractors. A contract can restrict storage and processing locations, specify approved regions, and require notice or approval before data is moved or replicated elsewhere. It can also limit the use of subcontractors or require that subcontractors meet the same location and control obligations because subcontracting is a common path for data to spread into unanticipated jurisdictions. Well-written clauses define what location means in operational terms, including backups, disaster recovery, support access, and telemetry, because otherwise the provider can comply narrowly while the system still behaves broadly. From a security leadership perspective, contractual restrictions are only as strong as the provider's ability to evidence them and your ability to verify them. So the inventory of services and their data handling commitments becomes part of the overall control environment. Replication across multiple regions is one of the most common ways legal exposure expands, because replication is designed to improve resilience while simultaneously multiplying jurisdictions. When data is replicated, the question is not only where the primary copy lives, but where all copies live, including near real-time replicas, backups, snapshots, and caches. Multi-region architectures can be intentional, such as active-active designs for availability, or they can be incidental, such as replication created by managed database features or by content delivery mechanisms. Each additional location can bring new breach notification rules, new access authorities, and new regulatory expectations, even if the business never directly interacts with that copy. This is why a sovereignty-minded architecture treats replication as a legal and governance decision, not only as a reliability decision. Encryption is often discussed as a solution to sovereignty concerns, but it is more accurate to say encryption changes access dynamics without necessarily changing jurisdiction. Strong encryption can reduce the practical risk of unauthorized disclosure and can limit what a provider can see, especially when keys are controlled by the customer rather than the provider. However, the existence of encryption does not magically remove the data from the legal authority of the place where it resides, and legal demands may still compel production of encrypted data, related metadata, or assistance depending on the applicable rules. The most important nuance is that encryption can restrict who can decrypt, but it does not prevent a jurisdiction from asserting power over the environment that stores or processes the ciphertext. In other words, encryption is a critical control for confidentiality, but sovereignty is still a legal question about authority and obligations. Conflicts arise when two legal regimes claim authority at the same time, and these conflicts are not rare in global operations. One jurisdiction may require disclosure or retention, while another jurisdiction restricts disclosure or requires deletion, placing the organization in a position where compliance with one obligation creates non-compliance with another. These conflicts can also surface in investigations where one authority seeks access to data held in a different jurisdiction, or where a provider is subject to demands from its home jurisdiction even when it operates infrastructure elsewhere. Security leaders should recognize that technical architecture influences how often these conflicts appear, because architectures that minimize cross-border dependencies reduce the number of simultaneous claims. When conflicts cannot be avoided, the organization needs governance mechanisms that involve legal analysis, risk acceptance decisions, and documented rationale, because the worst outcome is inconsistent ad hoc responses that create both legal exposure and operational instability. Data classification plays a direct role in determining residency requirements and exceptions, because not all data carries the same legal or business sensitivity. Highly regulated categories, such as personal data, health data, financial records, and government-controlled information, may have stricter localization or residency constraints, while lower sensitivity operational data may be allowed broader movement under general safeguards. Classification also supports proportionality because it lets you design architectures that keep the most sensitive data within strict boundaries, while allowing supporting telemetry and aggregated analytics to operate in more flexible ways, when permitted. Exceptions often exist for operational necessity, security monitoring, or legal compliance, but those exceptions tend to require documentation and compensating controls, and classification helps you define when an exception is legitimate. The practical point is that classification is not only about labeling, it is about making defensible decisions on where data can go and what controls must follow it. If you pull all of this together, data sovereignty becomes a discipline of aligning legal authority, technical architecture, and operational processes so that the organization's promises match the system's reality. Sovereignty is tied to where data resides and where it is processed, and jurisdiction can be triggered by region choices, business presence, and the practical flow of data through services. The controller and processor roles shape obligations across borders, and government access frameworks mean you must plan for lawful requests as part of the control environment, not as an edge case. Cross-border transfer mechanisms and contractual clauses provide governance structure, while replication decisions and encryption choices shape practical exposure and access without eliminating the underlying legal claims. When classification guides where data can live and how exceptions are handled, the result is a system that is not only compliant on paper, but also consistent in how it withstands real-world legal and operational pressure. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.